I think the afternoon tea session is the hardest session to talk at. So if anybody snores, just do it quietly. So today, while I've been sitting in the audience, I've been reflecting a little bit about the discussions that we've had so far today, which have really been about disasters that have affected whole regions. They've really been about major natural disasters, whereas what I'm going to talk about today is actually a very localised little disaster. Well, little in the sense of what we've talked about today, but that only happened within the National Library of Australia. And I've been asked to give this talk so that I can let you know about what actually happened, because everybody loves to see some photographs, and also to talk a little bit about how the National Library has changed since the time of the fire. So if I can drive this doobalaki. Oh, there we go. So I thought I'd put some photographs up while I talked, because of course photographs are much more revealing about the devastation that happens during any sort of disaster. So the National Library's fire happened in March of 1985, so quite a few years ago, before we had social media, before really the World Wide Web kind of took off. And so it was really through the mass media that people found out about the fire. It happened on a Friday night, because in my experience every disaster happens on a Friday night. It happened at about 7 o'clock, and the fire started off in the roof space of the building. Now, there are quite a few National Library people here today, but I don't think any of them were actually working at the library when the disaster happened. The fire actually marked a really important development in the library's collection disaster plan, because before the fire we didn't have one, and after the fire we did. So it was a very important event for us. So as I said, the fire started in the roof space above the library. It burnt through all of the roofing in some areas above some plant room and equipment, and the intensity of the fire buckled some of the main girders of the roof and left quite a bit of mess and devastation. During the time of the 1985, the National Library was having some renovation works. We were removing some asbestos from the air conditioning systems, and as a result of that work we had both the 4th and the 5th floors completely empty of staff. The 4th floor is a normal staff area, the 5th floor is a normal plant room area, and that there was a lot of workmen that were working in the roof space and the 5th floor, and a lot of plastic being used in the building to isolate the asbestos sort of removal activities. I just thought I'd mention, just to sort of clear the record, that there was actually an inquiry about, what was the cause of the fire. And when I first came to the library, there was sort of this thing that you were told, it was the workmen. And it was the workmen and it was the floodlight that got left on and got knocked over and caught fire in the roof. Well, I was very pleased to actually find out when I did the reading of all the government files, or our files, that wasn't true at all. In fact, they didn't really know why the fire started, but they believed it was because of a gas build-up of flue in the roof space, and that it could have happened really at any time. It wasn't actually related to the fire, to the asbestos removal at all. So when the fire started off, the firemen actually were wandering around the building trying to find the fire. It sort of wasn't really very obvious to them. And in the end, they ended up taking off the roof and pouring water in the top to put the fire out, because they couldn't get around the building. It was no electricity, it was dark, it was very smoky. And a lot of the smoke that came from the fire was actually really black, oily, sooty smoke, because what was burning was actually a lot of insulation off the pipework, a lot of electrical wiring, roof insulation, all sorts of things. Fortunately, no records. There was no collections that were burned. But for 6 hours, all this sort of material burnt. And while this was going on, the air conditioning was still operating. And so the smoke was actually being dragged through the building and being distributed nice and evenly across the collection. I didn't actually do any kind of a mud map of which bits of the building got the most damage, but obviously at some point the air conditioning did stop working. So this is actually a picture showing some of the plastic that was being used as isolation for the asbestos removal. And the fan units that didn't work afterwards. The National Library actually got about $3 million from government to repair ourselves after the fire, which at the time was, a lot of money, 1985. And it was quite interesting looking at the files, because in fact we basically got given cheques of money after, saying we needed money, and then we sort of gave back the change that we had left over, which I can't quite imagine happening in today's world, but I did find on file receipts for $1.5 million cheques that people had handed over, so it was nice to see the government money coming to a good use. There was a lot of cleaning up that needed to be done after the fire. The plant rooms on the 5th floor were really in a horrible mess, and of course first thing Monday morning you would expect our minister to be in the building and trying to reassure media that things were under control. When they first sort of talked about the fire in the media, they said, oh, it'll just take 3 days to, fix. Like, we'll only be out of business for 3 days or so. But in fact, it took about a month before the building was reopened to the public, and it took about a year before the collection was fully sort of cleaned and restored. This is Mr. Barry Cohen, who was our minister at the time. On the morning, well, basically probably on the evening of the fire, really on Friday night, people started turning up, wanting to help. And we've reflected a little bit in the talks today about how dangerous that can be. Like, just having people turn up and say, I want to help, is not always that helpful. But at the time in 1985, you probably didn't have quite the number of people, they weren't reading social media. They were listening to the radio, or some of them were watching the flames coming out of the roof. And so on the Saturday morning, about 100 people turned up to try and help out, and most of them were from other cultural institutions in Canberra. I wouldn't say all of them because I wasn't there. But those of you that know, on the left there is actually Ian Badderham from the National Archives of Australia, and he actually told me who the guy on the right was, and Moira, who was our maps curator, is in the middle of the picture there. So over the weekend, those people actually worked in the building with no electricity, I don't know that they wore gumboots, no one's mentioned that, but certainly in quite dangerous conditions. But they worked their way around the building trying to mop up. They actually started putting lots of intricate plastic caption devices, because what happened in the building was that the water was poured into the top floor, and so then it trickled all the way through the building, because the building's got a lot of expansion joints in the floors, and all the stairwells had water pouring down them, and so these sort of devices were put up to try and direct the water so that it wasn't actually affecting the collections even after the fire had been put out. The photo on the left is just showing you a little bit about, is showing you the layer of soot that's on the floor. That's just someone's footprints through the black soot. It's not a very good photo. As the water poured down the stairwells, it actually seeped under the doors across the floors. And of course, nobody was in the building at the time, so it just travelled across floors like that. Now, this must have obviously been taken when people started coming back to work, I think, the next week, but it looks to me like they've covered their desks with newspaper to try and stop them from getting, damaged. And the staff started some kind of clean-up. Now, in the files that I read, there was actually quite a lot of information about how long things took, but I won't sort of bore you with the details. But basically, when the staff came back to work, we had the same issues that we've talked about in other talks, is what do you do with all the staff who turn up to work when they can't do their normal jobs? And so, of course, a lot of them got put to cleaning. There was a lot of interleaving of books to dry the books out. It looks like quite a social event, really. But there are still staff in the building who remember sitting and doing the interleaving. The newspaper print was donated to the library for that purpose. There was a lot of laying out of wet collections. And this was actually our exhibition space. You can see the exhibition is still on. But the floor space was taken up with trying to dry out collections. And you'll notice, I can use this little divilaki. You'll notice here, the tide line here on these pamphlet boxes. These boxes were actually stored on the floor on the first floor. And the reason they were stored on the floor was because the stack itself was not big enough for the sorts of collections that were going into it. So when we got a new publication, it was put on the floor in front of the shelf where, Of course, we wouldn't do that these days. But all this damage could have been avoided if it hadn't been on the floor. And then what do you do with the staff who you've got who can't do any work on any computers? The computer system actually was completely destroyed by the fire, not because of the fire, but because of the smoke that it sucked in while it was still operating. And so the Australian Bibliographic database was on that computer, and so it was completely offline. Of course, all of our work computers didn't work anymore. Email, I suppose, was sort of around then, but nobody could do any cataloguing work. They couldn't do any contribution to the bibliographic database. So some staff actually quite fondly talk about the interfiling of microfilms of government publications. And apparently they had a big backlog of this interfiling, which got finished during the time that they couldn't do anything else. The downside of that was that all the new cataloguing that they needed to do for the new collections that were still coming in, they couldn't do any of that. And so it actually took the whole year afterwards to get through the backlog of new acquisitions that they were trying to catalogue. So I thought I'd put this photo there just to make you feel better that the fire is now over. Unlike the other talks today, where we've seen the devastation that's continued on. The fire was a long time ago. There is still evidence in the building. I was talking to Neil at morning tea. He still sometimes opens cupboards in the risers and sees the black walls inside there. So there is still evidence that there was a fire in the building, but it was a long time ago and there aren't very many people who actually remember it. So we're whizzing through the slides here. That's all the fun slides gone, I'm sorry. Now you have to concentrate. So I'm here to talk about what lessons we've actually learned, sort of as a result of the fire and since the fire. And when I was preparing this talk, it was a bit tricky because it's a bit hard to pin down when you actually learned a lesson. But I think that one of the most important lessons we've learned is that people always come first. And that during the fire that we had in the library, the firemen were actually being shown around by some of our building services staff because they didn't know their way around the building. We didn't have security passes back then that would release all the doors so that they weren't locked. The doors were all locked with keys and nobody knew where the keys were. They didn't know where the plant room was. They didn't actually know that the fire was in the plant room. So there were staff members who were wandering around the building with the fire brigade, actually trying to help put the fire out. And I think that probably wouldn't happen today. I think that the fire brigade, whenever they've turned up to the building, so far have said the site is now ours, stay out of the site. We're responsible for the site until we tell you you can come back in. And that kind of relates a little bit to what we were hearing about in Christchurch, is that when you're locked out of the building and you can't go and save your collections, you just have to sort of sit there and wait. But anyway, people come first, and there's a really large increase in the focus on public safety. Since 1985, we've all got much better automatic emergency evacuation systems. We've all got fire wardens that are trained. We have improved building codes that have sprinklers and all sorts of things that will go off. Of course, when the fire happened, the sprinklers were isolated for the building works. But, we still have much better systems of isolating only bits of sprinkler systems than we did at the time that the fire was on. We've got much better risk management these days than we had then, probably because of the disasters that we've had and the lessons that we've learned. We created a disaster collection plan straight after the fire, which, a little bit like the Christchurch example, was a bit of a tomb of information. And then as the years have gone on, we've realised that in fact the manual is the sort of training tool, and what you really do is just what you do. And then you reflect on whether the tool helped, and then you readjust the tool. We're in a process of readjusting it at the moment. But the collection disaster plan really helped us focus our attention on what we would actually do if we had a disaster, another disaster. We've got much better at risk identification and action plans. So as with most government institutions these days, we have our risk register, which talks about not only the risks to our collection, but all the other risks. And we've got much better at prevention activities. So, we have the standard disaster kit in every stack. We train the staff in how to use the disaster kit, so it's not a mystery to them when they open the lid and find out what's in there. We talk to them about the fact that their safety is actually paramount and that they shouldn't go into a disaster area if they don't want to, if they feel concerned for their safety. So that's actually the most important issue. Oh, I'm having the same problem that everybody else did. There we go. Communication is one of the things that we learnt after the fire. How difficult communication is. I mean, we've heard today about how we use multimedia these days and how we use Facebook and things like that. But of course, at the time that the fire happened, we didn't really have any of those things. We've actually, we had the situation where there was kind of nobody in charge. In actual fact, in 1985, the building manager was a person in charge because he was the one that knew his way around the building. But since the fire, we've created our emergency planning committee, which is a very effective committee that the National Library has maintained for the whole time since that fire. I thought I'd put this slide up, and when previous speaker was talking, I think it was Catherine, I realised I forgot to put human resources up there. We do actually have human resources sitting on our panel. So building services come to the meeting, information technology, media, reader services, because of course our relationship with the public is very important. Collections management, I go to the meetings. Security, exhibitions, These meetings happen every 2 months, I think it is. They seem to come around very regularly. And at these meetings we actually sit down and have a look at what the new risks to the library are, and they're not just talking about collection risks, we're talking about events that are happening. Like, for example, last week we had Skyfire that happens across the lake from the National Library, and one year they wanted to shoot fireworks off the top of the building. I think we did actually allow them to do that, but we said never again. But we do have these talks where we discuss what risks are coming up and what happened in the past. And we also meet in the event of something happening. So we actually get called to emergency meetings if there's something happening in the building. And we have that cool little SMS system so that our mobile phones get a message saying, you know, the EPC is meeting, please go to the meeting room. Or it tells us, you know, what the issue is that's at stake. So I think that the EPC is a very good outcome from the fire. We also have a lot of training. The EPC have desktop scenario training sessions where we pretend that something's happening in the building. The last one was about sprinklers going off in the main reading room, and of course no workman would be in the main reading room with the sprinklers not isolated. But it's very good to have a desktop scenario to really put you in mind of what could happen. But one of the really interesting learnings from having desktop scenarios is that the collections never get got to before the end of the scenario, because it takes so long to do everything else before you actually get to the collection. And I was visiting the Victorian Albert Museum last year on a work visit, and I was talking with their head of collections, and she said that in their disaster scenarios, which they have every month, I think it was, ever since the bombing in the London area, they have them very regularly. She said that even 30 hours after the event, their collections still haven't even been looked at, because they're most concerned with getting the public safe and getting the building secure and looking after staff. So it really means that when we're doing our risk management, we sort of have to remember that we're not actually going to be there when something happens, most likely, that we have to put in place things that will protect the collections so that when we're not there, they'll still be looked after. So business continuity we've talked about a little bit today in the broader context of what is our business and how is it affected by these disasters. Of course, in 1985, the library was shut for a month, which is pretty dramatic, but then it sounded like the State Library of Queensland was shut for about a month as well, so I don't quite feel so bad about that anymore. But, of course, that had a tremendous effect on our business, but not only that, our internet, like our network, just completely disappeared off the face of the map. And in fact, it was only because we were able to find a computer in another institution that we could use and use the backup tapes to get the ABN kind of back up and running that it happened so quickly. So there was a little bit of business continuity done even in 1985 because we had all those backup tapes. But, you know, one of the things that I found through the files that I was reading was that the collection, when the doors did open after a month, of course, there were still bits of the collection that weren't able to be used. They were wet or they were missing. I did hear on the grapevine that it was a sort of a convenient excuse if you couldn't find a record, not a collection item, I mean like a file that you might have had on your desk. You could just say it must have been the fire that did it. But that was only a off-the-cuff remark by one of my colleagues. I'm sure it wasn't true. But use of the collection during a mop-up is quite tricky, and one of the things that I've discovered in the years that we've had small disasters in the library is that one of the first things that happens is the electricity goes off, and then you can't open the compactors unit anymore. And you can't get it open until it's been okayed by the electricians to say that it's okay, and so all the water that's trickling down there, you can't do anything about until you can get the compactors unit back open. So there are some collections that you can't use, even long-term after a disaster, and that you have to have strategies in place for the communication you're giving to your readers about why they can't access it and what's happened to it. And that handling the media is one of those really important things that we've already talked about today, about their perception of what the disaster is and whether it's true or not, and how it's communicated to everybody. Vigilance is one of the things that we've learnt. I think that it's really significant that the Emergency Planning Committee is still meeting today, all these years later. Like, it obviously means that it's an important group that has a useful function in the library, and avoiding the "it won't happen again" attitude. We have to keep reminding ourselves that things do happen on a regular basis and that we can learn from all of them. So some of the things I thought I'd just reflect on, some of the smaller things that have happened in the library since the fire to show that we kind of have learned. We do get some floods happening. They're usually happening because of sprinkler heads being knocked off, and they're usually happening because a workman has knocked the sprinkler head off. And because of our plans that we have in place and the good communication that we have in the building, I would have to tell you that in all of those cases there has been plastic covering the collections that were surrounding that event, and that has actually protected the collection. But that also we've moved on in doing things like buying water pumps for our disaster kits, so that if there's a large collection of water we can pump it out the window if we need to, and having bollards in our kits so that we can actually collect the water in a place in order to pump it out. So whenever there's a sprinkler head knocked off, we sort of learn from why it happened and what we can do different. We do get dust in the collections when builders are working, particularly in the last few years when we had the refurbishment of the podium. For those of you that would know, the podium was completely lifted and resealed and then replaced, and all of the collection areas below that work were covered with plastic to stop the dust getting into those collections. We do have mould in the collections. Often it's brought in for new acquisitions that have come from somebody's shed or something like that. But we have procedures in place to make sure that it actually gets checked in the loading dock before it gets brought into the building. And so then we can identify that it is mouldy before it comes in, and we can deal with it appropriately. And we have regular training for our staff just to remind them that we need to be vigilant. And I usually send out an email, if there's a heavy rain, I usually send out an email to staff saying, can you just keep your eyes open for those stack areas that you're responsible for, and make sure you've walked around them just to check that there aren't any drips or things. So one of the fairly recent things that happened was when we were doing the refurbishment of our exhibitions space, our Treasures Gallery. We'd done a lot of work with our contractors. We actually have an induction form that they have to go through when they come on site, when they're starting a project, where we sort of explain to them, that we have collections and that they're vulnerable and that we want to take care of it and that we're serious about taking care of them. And we talked to them about liquids and how important it is to let us know if they're doing any building works with liquids and things like that. But on this particular day, the workman who was doing the floor levelling compound of the floor, he didn't really think that concrete was a liquid. Like, I'm sure he didn't really think about it. And I really would have enjoyed looking at his face while he watched it disappear down the hole in the floor. And fortunately, because we had some good strategies in place, he rang security and said, there's a problem. And they got downstairs to have a look at the situation. And so we had concrete slurry across some of the collection. But it could have been worse. We'd already covered the collection with plastic. We had to compromise because the stacks were highly used, and so the plastic didn't go all the way to the floor, which is why some of it got damaged. But at least we stopped all the other stuff from getting on the collection above. So we have learned some lessons. Now, I was asked to talk to you a little bit about DisACT, which is a group that's in the ACT. Disasters ACT is what the acronym is. And DisACT has existed since 1989, which is when the... is that the right date? I think it's the right date. When they're safeguarding our collections, our national collections, 1998. Safeguarding our national collections audit was done by government. And one of the findings from that audit was that our cultural institutions weren't adequately prepared for disasters. And so DisACT really formed itself out of that. And it's a sort of an informal network of all the cultural institutions in Canberra. It's waxed and waned a little bit over the years. A few people join us, a few people leave us. But it actually provides a forum for everybody to just come and have a chat about an incident that might have happened in their building, or something that they've learned about, or a resource that they found, or some pests that they had a problem with. And they can chat with the other people and find out that they're not only having the same problems, but they might have had this great solution, or there's a piece of equipment that can be borrowed. And so it actually provides support for our region. So the small historical societies come along as well. The university comes along. And so it provides a very good network for us to collaborate with each other. And we have lists of contact officers and equipment that's available to help. So because it's a sort of an informal network, DisACT has always operated under a memorandum of understanding. And a couple of years ago, we actually signed a new type of agreement, which was called a letter of intent. And so there are some of our CEOs, including Jan. And the idea was that this letter of intent really just helped us cover off some of those insurance issues if one of our staff members went and helped at somebody else's institution in the event of a disaster. And it's really just a goodwill document to show that we are serious about collaborating in the ACT. So there's a few other institutions. Oh, hang on, I thought it was gone. There's a few other institutions or regions, I think, that have used the same sort of model as DisACT. I'm sure there's many, but these are just two that I know about. The Ballarat Collections Network has the same kind of system, and the Canterbury Disaster Salvage Team. And so the model works really well for us in Canberra because we have such an intensive group of cultural institutions in a very small space, and we can network very easily with each other. And I think in these two areas probably they have the same sort of experience. So that was really all I wanted to tell you about the fire. Thank you very much.